Welcome to Somali Nexus, your trusted source for deep dives into the stories that shape Somalia, Somaliland, and the entire Horn of Africa. And I'm thrilled you're tuning in today. On this podcast, we explore the histories, the politics, the cultures, and the personal stories that often go untold, connecting the past and present to help us better understand where we're heading as a region. Whether you're part of the Somali diaspora longing for insights from home, a researcher digging into African politics, or simply curious about the world, Somali Nexus is here to bring you engaging, thoughtful discussions in every episode. Today, we're tackling a question that has puzzled many and shaped the geopolitical landscape for decades. Why did Somaliland break away from Somalia? On paper, Somalia and Somaliland share language, religion, and deep clan connections. So, what drove the North to declare independence back in 1991? Was it rooted in colonial-era divides, political and economic marginalization, or a profound cultural and identity difference that made coexistence impossible? In this episode, we'll journey back into history to understand how British and Italian colonial systems created two very different regions, each with its own political culture and priorities. We'll look at how the dream of Somali unity in 1960 gradually unraveled, and why so many people in the North felt they had no choice but to seek their own path. We'll also discuss what Somaliland's self-declared independence has meant for its people, the challenges, the achievements, and the lingering question of recognition on the world stage. So stay with us as we unpack the story behind Somaliland, Why Break Away? Right here on Somali Nexus. Hey there, and welcome back to the deep dive for you today. We're diving into a truly fascinating case study, one that really challenges our basic notions of what makes a country, well, a country. We've pulled together a pretty rich stack of sources for this deep dive. Everything from historical accounts, UN reports in depth, analyses from the International Crisis Group, and even a peek into online discussions. Our mission to unpack the perplexing reality of Somaliland. It's a self-declared republic that has, built a functioning democracy, maintained relative peace for decades, and yet it remains largely unrecognized by the international community. It's a story just brimming with surprising facts, local ingenuity, and some really big geopolitical questions. So, let's unpack this. Okay, so to understand Somaliland's really unique path, we absolutely need to start with the history. The crucial backdrop: the former British Somaliland Protectorate gets its independence back on June 26, 1960, and quite remarkably, it's recognized by around 35 governments almost immediately.
Right, which is pretty significant recognition straight off the bat.
Exactly. But then just days later, it voluntarily unites with the UN Trust Territory of Somalia, that was formerly Italian Somaliland, to form the United Somali Republic in July 1st, 1960.
Yeah, and on the surface, you think, okay, straightforward unification.
Right? Sounds simple.
But digging into the sources, it seems the merger was. While the term used is poorly prepared, apparently there were differing acts of union. Basically, two separate legal documents for the same merger that never quite legally aligned.
Wow.
Yeah, and this has led some legal scholars even back then to argue that the union might have been invalid from the very start. Legally flawed.
That initial kind of shaky foundation.
It definitely set a precarious stage. And it leads directly into the incredibly turbulent period under General Mohammed Siad Barre. He seized power on October 21st, 1969. And while he maybe had some support initially, his regime quickly turned brutal, particularly against the Isak clan up in the north.
The north being the former British Somaliland?
Precisely. The reports we looked at, they document indiscriminate aerial bombardment, hundreds of political prisoners, torture. This wasn't just random violence. It was systematic discrimination. It even included a declaration of economic warfare, specifically targeting the Isak.
Economic warfare?
Yeah, aimed at crippling them financially. All this fueled widespread discontent and inevitably the formation of the rebel Somali National Movement, the SNM, in 1982. And look, while Barre's government targeted other groups too, the sources really emphasize that the Isak community faced sustained and intense state-sponsored violence, to the point where some sources actually refer to this period as the Isak genocide.
That's staggering. Just a staggering level of oppression. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for Somaliland's story because it fundamentally shapes their future path, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Critical turning point.
When Siad Barre was finally kicked out in January 1991, southern Somalia just plunged into absolute anarchy, became, as some people call it, a quintessential failed state.
Brutal collapse.
But in the north, totally different story. The SNM and the traditional elders, they gathered at this big meeting, the Grand Conference of the Northern Peoples in Barrow. That was May 18th, 1991. And kind of unexpectedly,
Yeah, quite unexpectedly.
they declared Somaliland's independence, pulled out of the Union.
And that wasn't even their original goal. The SNM initially wanted reform within Somalia.
Really?
Yeah. But the sheer brutality they'd experienced under Barre, combined with the fact that a new government was forming down in Mogadishu without any SNM representation, well, it just spurred this popular shift toward full self-determination.
A real desire, it sounds like, to just establish peace and rebuild completely separate from the civil war raging in the south.
Exactly. A conscious choice to disconnect and build something stable. And what's truly fascinating, I think, is how Somaliland then managed to carve out that path to stability. It became, a functioning constitutional democracy with relative peace and stability, especially compared to the South.
A stark contrast.
A really stark contrast. And a key insight from the materials we looked at is that its government got virtually no direct financial aid. None. Because it wasn't recognized.
Right? No official aid taps open.
Which forced them to rely almost entirely on local sources of funding. Diaspora remittances, local taxes, business contributions.
Okay, so what there? Why does that matter so much?
Well, it's profound, really. This forced self-reliance, it kind of became Somaliland's hidden strength. It meant, crucially, there was no pressure to accept template political institutions from outside. No donors dictating terms.
Ah, I see. They weren't getting the standard good governance package pushed on them.
Exactly. It allowed them, or rather forced them, to negotiate their own, often clan-based political settlements. And this was often, as the sources say, a messy, consultative, and local process. Definitely not something you'd find in the good government's playbook.
Messy, but maybe more legitimate locally.
Perhaps, one anecdote mentioned a conference being stalled for days, literally days, just by the recitation of the Quran before any decisions could even be discussed. It shows the depth of the local process.
That's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? That the lack of aid actually empowered them in a way. It really highlights that local ownership. But were there downsides? Any trade-offs mentioned in the sources about this locally funded approach? It sounds maybe a bit too perfect.
That's a fair question. It wasn't perfect, no. While local funding gave them autonomy, it definitely meant relying heavily on contributions from, say, the business elite and the diaspora, which, while effective for peace building, might not have been perfectly inclusive of all sectors of society. Right from the start, there were inherent power dynamics.
Okay, that makes sense.
But despite those potential limitations, the peace process really was almost entirely locally funded. And there's this great quote from a minister talking to a researcher saying something like, "Aid is not what we desire, because then they decide for us what we need." That really captures the spirit.
Wow, powerful.
And central to this whole local process was the Gurti. That's the upper house of parliament made up of traditional elders.
Right, the elders. How did they function?
Well, these elders, importantly, they aren't just appointed chiefs. They achieve their positions through attributes like age, wealth, wisdom, religious knowledge, political acumen, real respect earned over time. And they operate in these open councils called Shur. They were absolutely pivotal in restoring peace, especially when the early SNM governments kind of faltered. They stepped into the breach, the Burama Conference early 1993, and the Sinag Conference later that year. These are consistently highlighted as really impressive examples of indigenous Somali peace and reconciliation processes.
A real contrast to the UN efforts down south, isn't it?
Oh, a massive contrast. These conferences actually created national charters, frameworks for security, for demobilization, for state formation. Real concrete outcomes from local deliberation.
So these weren't just talking shops, they were building the state. Another huge challenge surely must have been demobilizing all those armed militia. You had years of conflict. What did the sources say about tackling that?
Yeah, absolutely crucial. The estimates vary, But we're talking maybe 40,000, even 50,000 armed fighters floating around after the war.
Huge numbers.
Huge. And what's particularly interesting is that President Mohammed Ibrahim Eagle's administration, who came in after that Burama conference, they opted for no national army initially.
No army. That seems risky.
It does. But the thinking was that disarmament itself was key to autonomy and building lasting peace internally. Avoid creating a new potential power bloc. Eagle even used private loans, basically borrowing from the business community to demobilize about 5,000 militia fighters.
Borrowing from business to disarm fighters?
Yes, offering them stability, tax breaks in return for funding this demobilization.
And was that seen as legitimate?
Apparently, yes. While maybe not perfectly inclusive in how it was decided, many Somalilanders saw it as a legitimate price for peace because it worked. It brought stability.
Right, the ends justified the means, perhaps.
To some extent, and the reports we reviewed also reveal something often overlooked: the really significant role women played in peace building.
How so?
Well, everything from supporting demonstrations for peace, providing financial backing to the Gurti elders during those long conferences, to significantly influencing outcomes behind the scenes. In domestic settings, persuading husbands and sons. There's even a Somali proverb quoted, "Those whom women cheer for surely win." It underlines their influence.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And even things like elite secondary schools, like the famous Sheikh Secondary School, played a role. They produced leaders who really prioritized inclusive clan representation in the new structures. It's all interconnected.
It's truly remarkable, isn't it, how they built this functioning system, almost like a natural experiment in state building from the ground up.
Yeah.
So, okay, if they've achieved all this, if they seemingly tick the boxes for statehood, the Montevideo criteria, defined territory, permanent population, effective government capacity for foreign relations.
Which by many accounts they do. Somaliland itself argues strongly for the declaratory school of recognition, basically saying we exist as a state, in fact, so we should be recognized in law.
Right, so why isn't it recognized? Why does the international community continue to, look the other way? What is stopping the world?
That really is the crux of the issue, isn't it? And the primary reason, according to pretty much all the sources, boils down to the Pandora's box argument.
Pandora's box, meaning?
Meaning countries are incredibly loath, as one source puts it, to recognize breakaway states because it lends legitimacy to their own potential separatist movements.
Ah, the precedent fear.
Exactly. You see, this concern echoed implicitly or explicitly with examples like the UK and Northern Ireland, or Spain and Catalonia, or Ukraine and the Donbass region. Even hypotheticals like the US and Texas are sometimes mentioned. Though maybe that's stretching it.
Right, the fear of encouraging secession everywhere.
And this is a really crucial but an African Union fact-finding mission back in 2005. They actually went there, assessed the situation, and concluded that Somaliland's case was unique and self-justified. And importantly, they said its recognition should not be linked to the notion of opening a Pandora's box.
Okay, that's huge. The AU itself said it was unique. Why? What made their situation so different in the AU's view?
Well, a key part of the AU mission's reasoning pointed back to those colonial borders. The fact that Somaliland's independence claim was based squarely on the borders of the former British Somaliland Protectorate. This entity had a distinct legal existence, separate from the Italian-administered territory it later joined.
Okay, so it wasn't just carving out a new region from an existing state. It was restoring a previously independent entity's border.
That's the argument. And this ties into another key international law principle, uti possidetis juris.
Right. You mentioned that the idea of keeping colonial borders.
Yeah, it generally holds that former colonial administrative boundaries should be maintained as the new international borders when states become independent, primarily to prevent endless border wars. So, the sources suggest this could actually be a strong legal argument for Somaliland, because its claim aligns with those historical British borders.
Okay, so legally there's a case, but politically?
Politically, it's much tougher. The international community, and especially the African Union, has invested enormous amounts of time, money, and political capital trying to reestablish a functioning central government down in Mogadishu.
Decades of effort.
Decades. Recognizing Somaliland would be seen by many as completely undermining all that work. It would essentially accept the fragmentation they've been trying to reverse,
Pulling the rug out from under the Mogadishu project?
pretty much. And you also have Somalia's own position. Their transitional federal charter and subsequent constitutions explicitly state the country's territorial integrity is inviolable and indivisible, full stop. There's even an anecdote where a Somali prime minister simply suggested his government wouldn't object to Somaliland's recognition, and he was immediately and roundly condemned for a treasonable offense.
Wow, so very little room for maneuver there.
Exactly. So, given this incredibly complex and frankly quite hostile international landscape, Somaliland's foreign policy has had to be, well, very nimble. It's had to navigate some incredibly challenging waters, and it's evolved through its successive administrations too. You had President Abdirahman Tour right at the begin, focusing on hiring international lawyers to build the case for the independent statehood of Somaliland, trying the legal route.
Laying the groundwork.
Yeah. Then President Eagle, he focused more on practical regional relations, especially cultivating ties with Ethiopia, securing liaison offices there, but he also notably clashed with UNISOM, the UN operation in Somalia and Arab states, over this whole idea of Somali unity, which they often pushed.
Standing his ground, definitely.
Later, President Dahir Riyale, he really strengthened security ties with Ethiopia and significantly expanded outreach to the African Union, even formally applying for AU membership in 2005, building on that fact-finding mission.
Applying for membership while unrecognized. That's bold.
It is. And then more recently, President Ahmed Silanyo engaged in direct talks with Somalia, although those talks have often been pretty fruitless, stalling frequently. But he also significantly deepened ties with the UAE, particularly through big economic deals like the Berbera Port Agreement, trying a different angle again.
So adapting strategies over time.
Exactly. The research suggests that early foreign policy was often quite reactive, just responding to events and very focused on simply differentiation from Somalia, showing they were different, more stable.
That makes sense, having to constantly prove themselves. So, what do the sources say now? What are the current foreign policy challenges for Somaliland going forward? Where should they be focusing their diplomatic energy?
Well, the consensus in the analysis seems to be that Somaliland's foreign policy needs to shift towards becoming more pragmatically proactive.
Pragmatically proactive, meaning?
Meaning moving beyond just explaining their historical case and legal arguments, which they've done for decades, and instead actively strategically cultivating deeper relationships with key regional players, global actors, and importantly, finding ways to transform their existing trade cooperation, like with Ethiopia or the UAE, into tangible diplomatic assets, leveraging that economic utility.
Turning deals into diplomatic capital.
Exactly. Making themselves indispensable in practical ways, not just relying on the justice of their historical claim.
That seems like a crucial shift. Ultimately, though, listening to all this, it sounds like maybe their biggest worry isn't actually external rejection.
That's a very insightful point. And yes, ultimately the Somalilanders themselves, according to the research, view their greatest existential threat not as external invasion, but as internal combustion.
Internal combustion?
Yeah. The risk of their own hard-won peace collapsing from within. That peace is still described as precarious, resting on a very tenuous balance of clan power dynamics and those indigenous institutions like the Gurti.
So the internal social fabric is key.
Absolutely paramount. And if you connect this back to the bigger picture, it's really a powerful testament to an idea that comes up in development studies, that legitimate institutions are those born through local political and social processes, and that these processes are hugely shaped by leadership, by local negotiation, not by external blueprints.
So the real lesson from Somaliland isn't just about the politics of international recognition.
Right? It's maybe more profoundly about the fragility, but also the immense power of internal cohesion and locally defined legitimacy. It sort of redefines what national security really means for a state like this, especially one starting from scratch.
So, wrapping this up, what does this all mean for Somaliland, and maybe more importantly for your understanding of global politics? We've looked at a region that has really, against all odds, managed to build a functioning democracy, maintain peace, foster a strong sense of national identity, and done it all largely through its own local ingenuity and resources. Remarkable resilience. Yet it finds itself stuck in this strange international limbo, caught between, historical grievances, geopolitical precedents, and the very complex interests of the global community. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It really does. This deep dive into Somaliland's unique journey. It offers such a powerful lens, I think. A lens to examine what truly constitutes a state in the eyes of the world versus what actually makes a nation work for its own people on the ground. It really promises, I feel, to consider the value we place, or maybe should place on stability and self-determination, especially when it happens to challenge the established international norms and neat categories.
Exactly. That's perfectly put. So, as you go about your day, here's something to ponder. If a state can function, if it can thrive internally, build peace, operate effectively, without formal recognition from the rest of the world, what does that tell you about the global framework of statehood we currently have? And maybe more pointedly, who truly holds the power to define what counts as a country?